All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Health Mastery Show. As usual, I'm your host, Adam McDonald. And in today's episode, I have on with me a really interesting guest. That is Dr. Mike Israetel. So Dr. Mike holds a PhD in sports physiology and is currently the head of science consulting for Renaissance Periodization. Mike was a former professor of exercise and sports science in the School of Public Health at Temple University in Philadelphia, where he taught several courses including nutrition, public health, advanced sports nutrition and exercise, nutrition and behavior. So Mike is not a coach per se, but he goes around the world delivering lots of different seminars, specifically on training and nutrition. I met Mike about 2 weeks ago here in Dublin at the Renaissance Periodization Seminar, and we had a podcast, or we recorded this podcast shortly afterwards. But in this episode, we specifically talk about how to progress your volume over time. So from mesocycle to mesocycle or from week to week, because we know from most of the literature now that volume increases over time is going to be the number one determinant factor of hypertrophy or muscle growth. But Mike has a slightly different train of thought of how he actually does that. It's not just always about adding more weight or adding more reps or adding more sets. So we go really in depth into that in this episode, and I found it very interesting and I learned a lot. So if you do like this episode, please do subscribe to the podcast, leave a feedback or review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or wherever it is that you're listening. And if you do want to ask any questions specifically, we do have a quick fire Q&A at the end of this, which I got from my Instagram story. So usually I'll post up if I'm going to be getting on a guest. I'll say if you want to have a quick fire Q&A. So if you want to follow me there, get me at AdamMac192. But without further ado, let's get into this episode with Dr. Mike Israetel. So Mike, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
And how did you enjoy Dublin? I know that we met over the weekend. How was Dublin for you? I know it's not your first time here, right?
Totally. It's my second time here and hopefully the last. I hate Dublin. I hate the Irish people. Where do I even start? I mean, it was just awful. But on a serious note, Dublin's incredible. It's everyone is like really real, but also very nice. I guess genuinely nice, and we did go out one of the nights, and holy crap, you guys party. It's a totally different level of partying than really that I'm used to, and most people in the United States are used to. So Ireland just definitely lives up to its name.
Where did you go?
Fuck if I know. There were, who knows, man, some kind of Japanese bar, sushi place that turned into a nightclub at some point.
Do you drink alcohol?
I don't usually. I had since I was in Ireland, I did have a couple of pints, and it was disgusting as always, and I hated it. But I was there with a lot of good people, good friends, and it was really fun. And one thing I do like is that the people seem to just. Everyone who goes out in Ireland seems to be, for the most part, just interested in having as much fun as possible. In the United States, it's very rare for people to sing songs together in a bar, but it seemed to happen all the time, which is really a trip.
Yeah, it's actually it's pretty good crack, as we say, so good fun.
Yep.
So at the seminar at the weekend, one of the specific topics that you talked about, and I think I asked you the actual question, was a question around progressing volume. So I think you have a little bit of different insights into maybe what the overall industry would think of on volume in terms of how you progress it. I know you kind of have your volume landmarks, but when it comes to actual progression of volume from week to week or even mesocycle to mesocycle, how do you go about progression of volume? Because when I specifically asked you a question around total volume, you don't seem to use or look at just total or absolute volume from a mesocycle to a mesocycle, correct?
You mean as like mathematical volume of poundage?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, I don't look at that for hypertrophy. I actually have no idea what my mathematical volume is at any time.
So how do you go about progressing volume over a mesocycle to a mesocycle? Are there specific things that you do? So do you look at reps? Do you look at total weight? Or do you look at total sets?
Yeah. So it's usually volume is calculated by number of working sets that you do per session and also per week, right? Depending on how many sessions you have. So the number of working sets is very convenient because as weight gets heavier, it's likely to cause more muscle growth stimulus per repetition, but also cause more fatigue per repetition. So within the range of roughly 5 rep sets to roughly 30 rep sets, those two sort of tend to scale in such a way that the reduction of reps as you go heavier tends to cancel out with the increase in effect. Thus, sets between 5 and 30 reps are roughly equally fatiguing to one another and roughly equally stimulative to one another. So the working set allows us to have a way of tracking volume that incredibly simplifies the process, because it gives us just a number of 1 through 15, right, sets per session, maybe 1 through 40 or something sets per week per muscle group. And because we can use such simple numbers and we don't have to get bogged down into the heavy math of counting sets, reps, weight, distance, etc., we have a huge advantage in having the simplicity of being able to manipulate variables, detect changes, and act appropriately, all because most working sets roughly equivalent in their stimulus and their fatigue, and those are the two big things we want to know and manipulate anyway.
So when it comes to progression of, let's say, week to week or even month to month, do you try and push up all areas of volume, so sets, reps, and actual weight on the bar, or do you focus purely on sets? So, like, I know it's probably difficult for somebody who's more advanced, like for yourself. You're not going to be able to get stronger every single week or necessarily even add reps to a certain exercise. So is that the main reason that you focus on sets, or would you recommend that somebody who can progress on all three does progress on all three?
I don't. I usually like to view, in this case, I like to view progression as the effect of fitness and fatigue dynamics, rather than first seeing it as the cause, because it is also the cause, but I think it's best to view it as an effect. Another way to put that is, I don't necessarily, we don't progress as a matter of course. We don't progress to progress. We progress because there is a need to progress, because the training would otherwise not be difficult enough to get best gains. So, for example, here's how progression arises in hypertrophy training. You train 1 week, right? A certain, let's say, relatively difficult level, some degree close to failure, some number of repetitions, some amount of weight, and some number of working sets, right? We sort of impose this training volume and intensity, so on and so forth, on the individual, and we see the response. If the response has robust indicators that a hypertrophic effect is likely imposed, and has robust indicators that a considerable amount of fatigue has been imposed as well, then a progression is not really indicated, because the training is clearly really good, right? It's very, very stimulative, so no need to change anything there. And the training, if it's very fatiguing, progression is to some extent precluded by the fact that if you continue to progress past what is already very fatiguing, fatigue is going to skyrocket. It is going to accumulate beyond what is, you're able to recover from week to week, and then you won't be able to train productively anymore because you'll be too beat up, right? So if that's the case, if we look at how our training was last week, and we notice that it was very good on all grounds, we may make the very wise decision of just not changing anything, simply repeating the kind of training that we were doing. Now, as you may guess, can you still hear me okay, by the way?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, as you may guess, that is not a sustainable way to train. It's by simply keeping everything the same, right? So, you can say, okay, if training was good and it was hard, then we'll just repeat it next week. Okay, and how long? So what happens next week? Let's say it's, again, unchanged training. Let's say the training is, again, very good and very hard. No change again. And then we go into week 3 of the same training. And it begins to require quite a bit of imagination to imagine that identical kind of training is going to be maximally stimulative of muscle growth for any more than 2, maybe 3 weeks, I mean, for the love of God, in advanced individuals and individuals that tend to adapt relatively quickly to training, especially if we start on the low end of training volumes and intensities, which is a good idea for a bunch of other reasons, 1 or 2 weeks exposure to the same training means that week 2 or 3, the weeks after that, that same amount of training is going to start rating differently on our autoregulatory feedback factors, right? It's going to seem that it does not correlate as much to things that cause hypertrophy. It is going to seem to be causing very little fatigue, and which should make us suspicious that we're getting any adaptations, because adaptations free of fatigue would be quite the discovery. So what ends up happening is, now that we're training, maybe let's say a second week after our first, no changes, the second week might be perceived as, well, probably not growing as much muscle as it could. Because we have adapted, we can train harder, and our bodies need a harder exposure to continue to get the best gains. And thus and of course the fatigue will be lower. The fatigue imposed by that second week will be lower because we're so used to training like that, nothing new, that we're going to have some room to push the training harder because we have room in our cumulative fatigue threshold. So then the reaction in week 3 is to do something harder, right? And harder in what capacity is a question that can be addressed in fine detail, but it has to be more somehow. Now, that more can be generated by the following sort of criteria. First of all, we know for a fact, or fact is a bit of a stretch, we know it's highly likely that your best gains occur between 4 reps in reserve and 0 reps in reserve, right? And let's say you are conservative and you started your training in week 1 at 3 reps in reserve, and then, or 4 reps in reserve, fuck it, we start at 4 reps in reserve, and then we change nothing, and we do week 2 of training exactly the same training as we did week 1. Well, remember, neural adaptations, architectural adaptations, technique adaptations, and perhaps even a tiny effect of muscle growth itself will mean that you probably get an enhancement in performance, in the second week, and thus, in the second week, what was 4 reps in reserve for you in the first is now 5 reps in reserve, or even 6 reps in reserve. Now, hold on a second. 5 or 6 reps in reserve is already notably not as effective as 4 reps in reserve, 3 or 2 reps in reserve. So that's definitely just not an option, right? So then the next week, in week 3, we'll be like, okay, hold on a second. Week 2's training was okay, but it clearly was so far away from failure that it probably just wasn't maximally stimulative. What do we need to do to correct this? And you have one of 2 options. Either you increase the number of repetitions you do for each set and keep the weight the same, or you increase the weight on the bar and keep the repetitions the same. Of course, you can do some combination of both, but the general approach is you have to make things harder somehow, so that in week 3, you're now at least, at most 4 reps from failure, probably something like 3 reps from failure, and either on your way down in IRR every week, so that, 3 and then 2 and then 1, and then you deload because the fatigue is too high and you repeat, or at the very least, an average of 2 to 3 reps from failure and not trending down the entire time. So as you can see from that example, we impose progress, we impose more and more overload because otherwise the training would get too easy to be optimal. And a very similar thing can be said for volume, except we use slightly different measurements. So for example, if you began training and you got a little bit sore, and then in the next week you repeated that training and you got no soreness whatsoever, and you were able to very easily finish the workout, you could have done much more, your work capacity is very high, and you were more than recovered, right? Your performance returned back to baseline for week 2, and even then some, right? So you're more than recovered, and you're not remotely sore, and you even felt like the amount of work you did was very small. We know that, muscle damage competes with hypertrophy at some level, but at very low levels of muscle damage, the more work you do, usually the better. We know that set number correlates, for example, between 3 work sets and 10 work sets per session. The closer you get to 8 to 10, the more your hypertrophy is maximized for that session. So, for example, if we started a session at 4 working sets, and the next week we repeated 4 again, and those 4 working sets got us no soreness whatsoever, so there's almost no damage interference, very likely. And it was very easy to complete, so we had the work capacity to do it, and our fatigue was very low. Yeah, it starts to be a question of, why am I not doing 5 sets? There is no good answer to that question. The answer is we should probably do at least 5 sets, because that's going to get you closer to optimal hypertrophy, and it's going to allow you to recover just fine still and get you more muscle growth. So when your workouts are way too easy, when you're recovering from them way too easy, when they're not remotely in the area of excessively damaging, the research says that more volume is usually better. Thus, you should be adding volume when indicated to do so. Now, of course, on the other hand, if you're barely being able to match your performance, your reps in reserve are super, super low, the weight you could lift, you're barely lifting it, and you're getting crazy radical soreness that you're barely healing from, you take those indices and you go, what do I do next week? Of course, the answer is not to increase volume. It's not to increase intensity. It's not to increase the number of repetitions. Sometimes the answer is to take a deload or a short break and let the fatigue calm down before you ramp back up. So basically, in this view, volume progression and intensity progression and repetition progression is autoregulatory in nature. It comes from the need to make training hard enough to be close to optimal when the training is pretty obviously just a bit too easy to get your best gains.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but you would say that you should be trying to either, or at least a successful hypertrophy training plan, you should be trying to increase your repetitions, either increase or decrease the reps in reserve, so the proximity to failure, by either increasing the weight or the repetitions. And then if you're not feeling sore, then that means you should be adding more volume through way of sets, because obviously more closer to failure or more weight on the bar or more reps actually increases the overall mathematical volume. But if you're not feeling soreness, that's when you feel there's a time to add in more volume through more sets. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there's a number of other proxies which we use, not just soreness. But generally speaking, if you're recovering very well and you're on the lower end of the scientifically recommended volume ranges, then more volume is probably a good idea, because it's probably going to lead to more hypertrophy. The thing is, if you're incredibly sore or your performance is down or you're incredibly damaged, and performance and damage correlate very well actually, then clearly you're not even recovering or barely recovering from the current levels of volume. Probably not a good idea to go up, because then you risk doing too much volume past the point at which you recover, which exceeds your MRV, and thus you're almost guaranteed to get no gains at all, if not muscle losses. So yeah, I would absolutely characterize it like that. Now, the decision of whether or not to increase repetitions, weight, or some combination of the two is very contextual. I can address that if you'd like, but it's much smaller of a concern than something has to increase in difficulty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, yeah. So I guess my question would be, let's say for somebody who's advanced, or if we want to make adaptations, we need to be increasing volume over time. Does that mean that in 5 years' time, if you want to make progress, you have to be lifting more volume? Because you did explain to me in person about how it's not just absolute volume, but how the intramuscular forces are at work. So, for example, one example you explained to me was, let's say you're doing back squats and then you do leg extensions, but if you decide all of a sudden to do leg extensions first and then back squats, your absolute volume is going to be significantly reduced, simply just due to the fact that you can't lift as much on the squat now. So if somebody was looking at volume in an absolute sense, that would actually not kind of play into the rule of volume needs to go up over time.
Yeah, volume needs to go up over time is not a rule at all. The rule is you need to make sure to train your body with enough stimulus to get a robust level of adaptations. The amount of volume that counts as a robust stimulus may increase, but if you're looking at volume mathematically, it's almost always going to be the case that volume goes up over the training career. If you look at volume from the perspective of number of hard sets, it actually tends to peter out over the course of 3 to 5 years, and then may even go down later, because as you get stronger, absolutely stronger, right? You go from squatting 100 kilos to squatting 150 kilos. The amount of stimulus per any repetition goes up a lot. In addition to that, your technique gets better, and your mind-muscle connection gets better, so you're able to make every repetition more hypertrophic, even if we discounted the fact that it was already more hypertrophic because it was heavier and produced more force. So now you're essentially more efficient with your training as your training age expands, assuming you're not completely retarded and just have no idea what you're doing and just banging your head against the wall, right? Most people learn something about making their exercises more effective for them over time. And if you add in that with the load increase that you tend to experience as you get stronger, the number of hard sets doesn't have to go up, right? It cycles between low and high at various phases of training, but in general, if you do 5 sets of 10 with 60 kilos on the squat, that's going to be a very, very robust amount of stimulus and fatigue for someone who's not very experienced. Eventually you may get up to doing roughly 10 sets of 10, sort of, in a session at 100 kilos for someone that's, 5 years into training, quite advanced and very muscular, and they need that much training volume in order to get their best gains. Now, if someone's squatting 150 kilos, 8 sets at 8 years into their training or 10 years into their training, 8 sets with 150 kilos, 8 sets of 10 may be more than enough to stimulate the highest levels of adaptation, and any more than that would just be excessively fatiguing, right? So what's really super important isn't to proactively drive volume. I think that's actually usually a bad idea, right? You're not supposed to be looking over the course of your career and being like, fuck, I'm not doing enough volume. I should be doing more by now. I've been training for 5 years. You should be looking over your current way that you respond to training and saying, am I training with enough volume to get really good pumps, to get good strength gains over time, that I'm getting a really good mind-muscle connection, that I'm getting lots of perceived tension in the muscle, and am I getting at least a little bit sore, or at least almost sore if I'm doing a very high frequency program? Do I feel fatigued from this? Because if I don't, it's probably not maximally hypertrophic. And if you can check all those boxes, then you're clearly doing enough volume. But if, for example, even if you're doing more volume 5 years from when you started, but you don't get sore at all, I mean, not even close, you're not even hardly fatigued, you get no pumps from training, or barely any pumps. As soon as you almost start to get a pump, you quit, you stop training, because you just, that's enough sets, is what I wrote down in my notebook. And if you perceive your training to be incredibly easy, you're saying, well, like, I just, training is just not that hard, right? Then, it's doubtful that you're going to be getting very good hypertrophy. So based on autoregulation, yes, on average, your mathematical volume will almost certainly go up through most of your training career, though that's offset a little bit by technical enhancements and mind-muscle connection enhancements. And then, in addition to that, your set volume, a number of hard sets that you're doing per week or per session, will be going up for the first 5 years, a little, to some extent, not a huge extent. And then it'll probably be stable for maybe years 5 to 10, and even decline in some of those years, because you're getting so strong and learning to use your body in such efficient ways that you don't need that much volume to continue to grow.
Yeah, I remember watching a video from Layne Norton a couple of years ago, and he was saying that, I think it might have been his DVD at the time. DVDs are big.
Yeah, that's a long time ago. Look at you showing your age.
Yeah, it was his prep. So I was a big Layne Norton fanboy. So I brought his prep DVD. I think it's called Unleashed. And he was saying that he was training, like, he was doing five days a week. He was training for like 3 hours. And he mentioned at some point that he needed to train that much because his volume had increased so much over his training career that's the amount of volume he now needed to make any sort of noticeable progress. So I guess, thinking that way, I usually train like an hour or so, and I'm fairly advanced. I mean, I still got a good few more years, but if I'm thinking that way, I'm like, how am I going to fit more volume? I'm not really getting that much stronger because I don't train for strength specifically. Do I need to increase my set?
Are you getting stronger in the 5 to 30 rep range?
I am, but slowly. So, I mean, I could significantly increase my volume by increasing sets. Obviously, I could increase my volume by like 20% by simply just adding in extra sets. But that means then that my absolute number of sets are going to go up over time. So, what are your kind of thoughts on that? In terms of just, as you get older and as you get more advanced, so think of like the likes of like Jeff Alberts. He's like doing hardly any sets. Like, how does he actually progress? Because his 30 years of training or whatever it is, he hasn't really gotten significantly stronger in the last 10 years. He has made some small but noticeable progress. He hasn't done more sets. He hasn't necessarily done more reps. So how do you kind of quantify how he progresses at all?
How much more lean body mass do you think he's carrying versus 10 years ago?
I'd say 15 kilos. No, I'm joking. I don't know. Maybe it's probably minimal. But I mean, what is going on there? Because like it's interesting. You talk about like how as we get better mind muscle connection, we can improve our basically intramuscular forces. So do you think that there's possibility that, as you say, age or if time restriction is an issue, that we can start to do things like intensity techniques or pre-exhaustion that will give us the same results? So if you're like in the gym for 2 hours 5 times a week, and you're like, I'm just sick of this, I'm not enjoying it anymore. Do you think that you could just pre-exhaust everything and get way better intramuscular forces and grow that way, even though you're technically cutting down your absolute volume by a lot?
Yeah, so I wouldn't look at absolute volume, which is why I don't. What you want to look at is am I doing enough to stimulate the local musculature I'm trying to grow to get close to optimal, my best estimate of what optimal adaptations really are. And so as long as you're checking those boxes, you should be viewing it as perspective of I'm doing what it takes. How that ends up occurring is really just, it's not up to me, it just, that's how the cards laid out, and that's okay. So for example, if it seems that you're getting your best workouts doing dumbbell presses and in your first several years of training, okay, you got dumbbell presses in your first several years of training, you're getting great workouts with 10 sets of dumbbell presses per session, let's just say, okay. And then over the years you sort of learn that the barbell gives you a much better mind muscle connection. And you also learn how to pre-exhaust your chest with some dumbbell flies. And you notice that it's actually 6 or 7 sets total between those two exercises checks all the boxes of how pumped you're getting, how sore you're getting, your performance improvements over multiple months. It checks all the same boxes as 10 sets of dumbbell presses were. Is that a problem because it's lower mathematical volume? No, it's not a problem at all. It's a solution, right? So my question to Jeff Alberts would be, hey, Jeff, are you feeling challenged in the gym? He may say yes. Say, are you getting regular pumps from your training? He would say, well, yeah, for sure. Are you feeling, lactic acid accumulation in the muscles that's relatively debilitating, when you're doing higher reps? Totally. So are you feeling a lot of tension perception, sort of very damaging tension perception through the muscle when you're doing very low reps? Yes, absolutely right. Are you feeling like, you are challenging your recovery abilities regularly in your training? Are you pushing the limits to some extent? He would say maybe, yeah, sure. And then I don't have any more questions to ask him, because if all those things are true, he's probably doing enough volume, right? I have no idea if they're true for him whatsoever. It would be preposterous and insulting for me to speculate on his exact situation, right? I think asking Jeff Alberts for that info would be much more productive. But, it's not one of these things where it's like, oh, back when he was in his 30s, he did 10 sets and now he only does 5. And how do you explain that? The beginning of that explanation is he probably hasn't grown much muscle in the interim, which is, sounds really obtuse to say, but it's probably nonetheless true. And he probably has grown some because of his ability to be really in touch with his training, probably because he's maybe doing less volume now and emphasizing more recovery, which could actually fuel better gains. I mean, the point isn't to do more volume until you're toasted and fucking broken. The point is to dose volume appropriately so that you're getting your most robust adaptations. And sometimes people spend years training with higher volumes than are optimal, and then they drop their volumes and they get even better gains. I've done that before. So it's not like you sort of magically desensitize to volume and you forever need higher volumes. All it takes is a 1 week deload and you're desensitized, resensitized to most volume again. You take a 4 week low volume phase, you come back to training like you fucking barely have ever trained, right? So your volume sensitivity is super high. That's an easy fix. So, but nonetheless, that you can be in the situation where it may take a way more volume than it ever took for you to continue to get gains. So the Layne Norton example is very possible, right? It just, what I want to know is, between Layne Norton and Jeff Alberts, are they filling out that checklist appropriately? Are they getting the good pumps? Are they getting challenged in the gym? Are they still recovering on time? If the answer is yes to all those questions, we're just dealing with 2 different individuals and 2 different volume demands. And both of them can be completely correct. One of them may have been pushing volume too hard back in the day, and one of them has only now gotten up to where he's pushing volume hard enough to his abilities.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it leads me into 2 questions. The first one being, do you recommend then periods of lower volume, let's say at what you coin your minimum effective volume, so that you can resensitize yourself? So let's say you don't have to end up in that position where you're like, I need to push up more volume, more volume, more volume. Do you think that there's periods of lower volume will, like longer than say like a deload, but it's like planned periods of low volume, so that you can resensitize yourself to volume, so you don't have to keep going up and up and up?
Yeah, I think once every macro cycle, which is to say once a year or twice a year. So I think about a month of lower volume training, or perhaps even just 2 weeks of what we call active rest, which is where you barely do anything, are a real good idea to really resensitize for volume, and also to heal micro tears and little injuries, and also to revitalize your psychological attitude and training. I very rarely have crises in my own training of like, oh, I don't even feel like doing this anymore. I very rarely hit motivational plateaus, because after forays into incredibly high volume and intensity periods, I intentionally take time to do very easy training so that my psychology recovers as well as my physiology. So for all of those reasons, I think a 2 to 4 week period of lower volume training is a very, very good idea. And it's one of those that I don't need to convince anyone of, because it just becomes apparent at some point. You're doing more and more volume, not because you're like, I need more volume to grow. It's because anything less simply doesn't get you pumped and get you sore and get you a perception of effort anymore, right? Your work capacity has become so high that now you just get much more fatigue out of the volume than you get stimulus, right? And that something that's a problem, right? That you can't keep going up like that simply because your fatigue tolerance is, will be the cap to your abilities instead of your requirement for stimulus.
Your work capacity is basically too good. You need to
Yeah,
actually.
sure. Well, it's, your work capacity is really good, but your recovery ability is too bad for your good work capacity. And in addition to
Makes
that,
sense.
one thing that high work capacity tends to do is the very kind of alterations, slowing of fiber types, and various other things that enhance work capacity, also reduce the magnitude of gain you get for any one session. So every now and again, if your work capacity is really great, the same ways that it got great are the same things that also means you get less out of every session. The people with the highest work capacity are ultra marathoners, right? I mean, for God's sake, their bodybuilding workouts would be like a sick joke to them. It would be pathetic. They could recover from 2 bodybuilding workouts every day, probably, not twice a week. But how much do they adapt? They barely grow any muscle, because they're almost all highly slow twitch, and those are fibers that are incredibly high work capacity. But literally, the way they get there is by turning off and decommissioning machinery designed to grow muscle. So every now and again, you got to turn back the clock, go to really low volumes to reinvigorate the machinery that's designed to grow muscle, and that will reduce your work capacity, which is no big deal because it enhances the sensitivity to stimulus.
So doing things like cardio, which some people do to increase their work capacity. So I've heard people saying, well, I'm going to do some aerobic activity in my off season, not for fat loss, but so I can increase my work capacity. I think that's actually a bad idea, because we don't want our work capacity to go up too high, and we let the actual progressive volume over time do that, because we don't want our work capacity to basically outpace our recovery capacity.
Yeah, I think I'll put you this way. I don't think it's a problem that your work capacity outpaces your recovery capacity. The problem is your sensitivity to stimulus outpaces your recovery capacity, right? Like the amount
Gotcha.
it would take to get you to grow is no longer a recoverable amount, or very, very close to it. So you just can't do it for long. And the thing is, your work capacity pushes up your recovery capacity, but it pushes down your sensitivity to stimulus, which is very, very unfortunate. So to answer your question about cardio can be used to reduce body fat and can be used to keep it lower. Cardio can be used to take your work capacity from total shit, like unable to finish a squat workout of 3 sets of 8 because your lower back cramps. Cardio can do that and can maintain general health. But if you want cardio to be able to recover from more lifting, and you're using cardio to do that, you want the work capacity to be able to recover from more lifting and be able to do more of it, the best way to do that is sport specific, is to lift more. So, people think, oh man, I need better work capacity for my legs. Work up slowly over the course of several months to training your legs 4 times a week. You'll have all the work capacity in the world. And by the way, you'll have big legs versus, being able to have a crazy work capacity by cardio. Now you've built all this machinery for work capacity to literally come at the expense of hypertrophy. And then someone asks you, hey, so what do you have all this machinery for work capacity? You're like, to grow. And they're like, but you've cost a bunch of muscle growth getting it. You're like, right, yeah, I should have thought that through. So the cool thing about high volume training, or sort of incrementally higher volume training, simultaneously gives you a higher work capacity and grows muscle at the same time. A self-solving problem.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah, well, I would give a very simple answer to something like, so somebody would ask, should I do cardio for wrestling? My best answer would be, if you need more cardio on top of your normal wrestling, yes, but you should be doing enough wrestling training that most, at least, of your cardio comes from wrestling, because it's the most sport specific, right? How do you get good cardio for wrestling? Fucking wrestle. Now, sometimes wrestling that much is untenable because
injuries and everything.
Injury. So then you supplement it with cardio, but that's a good reason to supplement with cardio. Whereas the bodybuilding reason, it's, if you know cardio costs you gains or potential for gains, it becomes one of those things you have to dose it very mildly, if at all.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And then from a practical point of view, so my second question would be, let's say I was doing leg press, so something that's not overly technical in terms of like exercise selection, and I was doing 3 sets for 10 this week. What would be those markers that you kind of talked about, soreness, pumps, that you would look at the end of a workout or in a couple of days that would dictate whether I increase weight, reps, or sets next week?
Yeah. So let's say you hit your sets of 10, 3 by 10.
Yeah. Let's say RPE or reps in reserve, 2 reps in reserve.
2 reps in reserve. Sweet. My next question is, how many weeks would you like to continue training for?
All the weeks, forever. No, I mean,
forever.
just an off-season training plan with, let's say, like a 5 weeks mesocycles or something like that.
So in a 5-week mesocycle, you don't want to go to failure until the last week, because once you go to failure with a high number of sets, you're not going to be able to recover for the next week, right? So if we look at it that way, then we're probably going to want to keep those 2 reps in reserve for this week, next week, and maybe even a week after that. So at least the next 2 weeks, right? So if you want to keep the reps in reserve essentially the same for next week, and it was 2 RIR this week, then you want to adjust the load or repetitions next week by whatever amount will get you to 2 RIR again, right? And that could be like 2.5 kilos on the bar, or it could be 1 rep added to each set. With me so far?
Yep.
Cool. And the decision for volume comes from one of, well, how do the 3 sets of 10 make you feel? First of all, did you get a pump? If you got a really good pump, then you're doing super great, and that by itself probably says you don't need to get any volume added. But let's say you got like not so great of a pump, like barely a pump. Like at the end of set 3, you're like, ooh, I'm starting to feel it. But then you're like, man, I could really use another set to get a good pump, but you stopped. And then let's say effort perception was very low. You're like, man, I walked through that workout, right? It was super easy. And then you didn't get sore at all. And then 3 days later, when you did your next leg workout, you were like, well recovered. Like there was no challenge to recovery at all, because you seemingly never even disturbed anything. Right? In that case, you sort of have the philosophical question of, what am I betting will cause me more growth? On 3 sets again? Or 4 sets, right? And the answer is, well, okay, 4 sets will probably give me a better pump. It'll probably give me, at least get me closer to being sore. It'll burden my recovery to some extent, which is almost a necessity for progressive training. And it's still going to be well within my recovery ability, because I was nowhere close to challenging that. And it'll also feel like a bit of effort, which is probably correlates somewhat with program outcome. So you say, well, gee, I think 4 sets wins all those questions. So then I add 4 sets. Or sorry, I add 4 sets. Jesus Christ, go to 7, right? Then I add a set, and go to 4 sets. And then let's say that workout goes just about the same way the 3-set workout did. And it basically is scored like, barely a pump, barely this, barely that. Then you go further. The other hand, go ahead.
Yeah, so you'll be increasing the intensity each week anyway, so that will be programmatic. So you mean the reps in reserve will be getting closer to 0 as you go, and that's more programmatic rather than saying, what should I add sets or not?
Yeah, a little bit. So I mean, there's arguments to be made for just staying 2 RIR the entire time. The only problem with that is there's no good argument for staying at 2 RIR in like your last week of training, because why not just go to failure or close? Someone say, oh, accumulated fatigue. Well, it's worth it because you have deload anyway, right? And there may be some unique benefits to training very hard, because there might be some motor units that are so high threshold, they don't really turn on and get a lot of tension throughput for long at all unless you go 1 RIR or 0 RIR, which is very possible. And So it ends up being one of these things where a training program generally ends up having as many reps in reserve as weeks out from deload, unless you repeat some weeks, which is okay to do. So, for example, if you have a 4-week program, you start at 3 RIR, then 2 RIR, then 1 RIR, then 0 RIR, then deload, right? That sort of progression allows us to really push the volumes, they push the intensities and push the reps, get the most we possibly can of our program, because we don't want to succumb to the critique of, why did you stop your last week at 2 RIR? You could have pushed it harder. Well, there's no really good comeback to that. So we say, okay, yeah, I think that 2 RIR would have been a good idea. So then you start at lower RIR. Here's a downside of starting at 2 RIR. Well, let's say you say, I'm going to start at 1 RIR in week 1. How long do you think you'll be able to maintain that effort, right? Sure as hell not going to be 5 weeks, right? It might be 2 weeks. And because you're going to go 1 RIR, 0 RIR, and then what? You really think you're going to maintain your performance 2 weeks in a row, multiple sets to failure? Probably not, right? So then you say, okay, well then what do I do with RIR? Well, you start at more like 3 or 4 RIR. And someone could say, well, why not start at 6 RIR and then have an even longer mesocycle? Well, the answer to that is 6 RIR has not been shown to be sufficiently difficult to be hypertrophic. Do you see how there's kind of this gray zone where we want the whole zone to ourselves? We want all of it because all of it is productive, and the longer we can stretch out a mesocycle, the more we get to train productively. But if we try to bias it to one end or the other too much, we end up missing on growth, or the mesocycle becomes too short or too long. So there's kind of a middle ground there, usually between 4 to 6 weeks in mesocycle length, or 3 to 6 weeks. Beginners don't really apply because they can drop fatigue so quickly. You can just keep adding for them, and they just keep going, right? Then for more advanced individuals, 3 to 6 weeks, starting at around 3 RIR, trending downwards, adding some reps, adding some weight, and as needed, adding some sets.
So it doesn't really matter between adding weights or reps, because if you stick with the same weight but add reps, that will increase the RIR or decrease the RIR. But if you add weight, that will and stay with the same reps, that will also increase the intensity. So it's kind of, totally. We're in that rep range of. I think you mentioned that you think that probably 10 to 20 is more, more conducive to hypertrophy than 5 to 30.
It's more of a guess, but I will say that there may be advantages to training in a variety of rep ranges, and also advantages to training in specific rep ranges in specific times. So what you might want to do is, you can add reps so long as you don't leave the rep range. Let's say you start at your first set of laterals, dumbbell laterals for shoulders is 18 reps. You don't want to train that for 12 weeks and be at 32 reps, or at 28 reps, because that's
once you go over 30, then you just lose. You start to lose gains.
Right. So that's part 2 of the critique, right? So once you go outside of your target rep range, your specificity drops, and you're sort of not doing what you intended to do. So I would say that rep increases are okay so long as they don't leave the target rep range. And then in addition to that, I think that past 30, you definitely should be increasing weight, because you don't want to go much past 30 reps, because the efficiency of gains drops. The stimulus to fatigue ratio might drop off as well. And then at that point, weight versus reps within those constraints is roughly equivalent, but usually, weight's very easy to add on barbell movements, and a lot of times weight can be added with a very small increment. So for example, if you're an advanced squatter and you're doing sets of 8, you don't just go to sets of 9 the next week. Holy fuck, that's a huge PR by itself. And you sure as hell don't do that for 4 weeks. I mean, can you imagine if you put your close to your 8 rep max on the bar and you did it for 3 sets of 5 in the first week, and then by the end of your 5-week progression, you did it for 6 sets of 9. I mean, holy crap. That just doesn't happen for advanced lifters. No. So a lot of times weight additions are much better for advanced lifters because they can go in such small increments with the big exercises. But then again, for dumbbells, you lift a 10-kilo dumbbells, you're not going to go to the 15s next week. That's crazy, right? You don't squat 100 kilos one week and go to 150 the next week. It's the same jump. So maybe adding repetitions there in sets of 10 or sets of 12 will be much more conducive to those small increments that we have to do in order to keep our reps in reserve where we want them.
Yeah, it's basically whatever's most conducive to a small increase in intensity.
Yes, to the needed increase in difficulty that keeps our RIR either the same as it was last week or a little bit less, which is generally what we want to see with hypertrophy training.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So, Mike, we're almost coming up on time. So I got some rapid fire questions that I asked on Instagram. Okay. So I just want you to give a quick answer to these. Some of these you could probably spend a whole podcast talking to, but just a very short answer for each one. So first one, are there any general conditioning landmarks you use for combat sport athletes?
can you survive 2 back-to-back hard rounds? If not, you need more conditioning.
Pretty good. What do you think of a plant-based diet?
I hate the term. Hate just barely begins to describe it. So a diet that has 30% exclusively animal products and 70% plants is plant-based. Because when you call something based, it is to assume that the base of it is what we're talking about, and not the entirety of it. I think the term people really should be using is vegan diet, because we have a fucking term for that already, and it's a fine term. And I think veganism has incredibly great upsides in potentially small upsides in environmental impact, though I'll say those are minor. Massive upsides in the morality and ethical treatment of animals that are very, very good to consider. I highly encourage people to consider a vegan diet. And if you want it to maximize muscle growth, then it's probably possible to get to very close to maximum muscle growth, just making sure you do the vegan diet right and supplementing properly. You don't have to eat meat to get really, really good gains. But the term plant-based diet drives me to no fucking goddamn end.
What are your thoughts on Dogcrap training?
I think any training that's called Dogcrap is fucking stupid, but self-definitionally. But no, on a serious note, I think Dogcrap training is really cool because it has a progressive overload system built into it, similar to the one I just described, actually, right? Like if you get stronger, add more reps, right? Or you add more weight. And that makes it very, very, in very, very sparse company in bodybuilding training circles, which mostly are just, there is no progression built in because people are too fucking stupid to think about that. So generally, I think BC training is really cool. My critiques of it is that it goes to failure all the time, which is not great. Not terrible, but not great. And that I would love to see a progression in volume as well as relative intensity.
What's your dream research study and topic and method of analysis?
Oh, yeah, I have an easy one for this. And people are going to get pissed, but they did say dream. My dream research study is to have millions of cohorts of individuals living in Truman Show style lives where they have no idea what's going on, and we impose various nuanced hypertrophy training and diet program differences to them, so we have insane sample sizes.
That's
and
hilarious.
We can really get at what optimal really is. Mm-hmm. Oh, we get to dissect them afterwards.
But bodybuilding Big Brother.
Yes, 100%, but like way worse, like the bodybuilding Matrix.
When adding sets, do you add another set at the same weight, or do you add a down set? I think that's a Jordan Peters term, but down set is like a back off set.
Yeah, so it depends. Are you going to be in your target rep range if you add the set with the same weight? If the answer is yes, then you keep the same weight. If the answer is nope, I'm going to fall out of my target rep range, then you probably do a down set. So for example, if you're doing squats in the 5 to 10 rep range, and you're doing 6 sets and you want to add a 7th set, but if you add a 7th set at the weight you're using, you're going to get like 3 reps. Add a set at a lighter weight so you can get at least 5 reps.
So stick with RP across the set.
Yep.
Or RIR, whatever.
Yeah, RIR and the rep range that you desired.
Yep. Thoughts on the movie Gamechangers? I don't know if you watched that.
So a couple things. I haven't seen it. I'm almost certainly not going to see it. I don't watch propaganda movies for fun. Here's my dream study. Fuck the study. Here's my dream movie. I want to make a movie called Another Vegan Propaganda Film, and it's going to be the same movie released every year. I'm going to probably dig up an old post I had. I actually did a TEDx talk where I ended the talk with saying it's just a matter of time until another nutritional propaganda movie comes out that's going to try to tell you that healthy eating is this and that versus the actual balanced scientific perspective. Be on the lookout because it's coming. Okay, here it is. I gave that talk like 2 years ago. Gamechangers. And mark my words, in about 2 or 3 years, another vegan movie will come out. And by the way, there's going to be a fucking carnivore movie, and there's going to be a fucking paleo. There's all kinds of shit. It's fad bullshit. The vegan diet has the innumerable advantages that I listed some of them earlier, but it's not the end-all be-all. Other diets have really great advantages. There's many, many ways to eat healthy. And this kind of crisis epidemic style view of nutrition where celebrities and quote unquote scientists talk about it as pure dog shit for people that are very fucking gullible.
Waffles or pancakes?
Oh, Jesus, that's the fucking shit. Waffles. But don't quote me on that.
What's your opinion on negative or eccentric training as a way to go all out before a deload?
It's okay as long as it's safe. It can get into real deep shit because you can just go straight to eccentric failure and then you're real deep shit.
I suppose that will massively increase soreness, which could,
Well, it's before deload, right? So you're good to go. As long as you're not doing it so much, you know, you don't try to do everything you can before deload, just a little more than you're used to, right? So if you radically introduce a new variable and get so sore that you mostly spend time healing from damage instead of adapting, you went too far.
So 2 final questions.
Hit me.
We've got a ton, but opinions on Rackpulls for traps hypertrophy.
Yeah, they're great, but they cost a lot of axial fatigue and systemic fatigue, so I prefer just doing shrugs.
All right. And the final question is, when massing, what is the optimal body fat percentage for growth?
Yeah, we're not really sure about that, but myself and a few others suspect it's between somewhere between 10 and 20% body fat. They maybe 8 and 20%. And if we have to get more specific, it's something like 10 and 15. But there's a very, very general numbers, and the optimality doesn't drop off like crazy. If you mass to 21%, you don't automatically start gaining pure fat. But if you're much fatter than 20% as a male, and for females, all these are up by about 5 to 7%. If you're a male and you're much over 20%, it's probably good. You'll probably get better muscle growth results if you're a little leaner. And if you're under 8% or 10% body fat, you should probably be massing for a long time before you think about cutting.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. That was very, very insightful, and I appreciate you coming on.
Dude, my pleasure. Thanks so much. I got to get going.
Where can people find out more?
Oh, I'm sorry. Fuck. Yeah. Dude, you don't want to find out more about me. Stay the fuck away from me, people. That's the only advice I have. Just kidding. Renaissance Periodization, RP Strength on Instagram, is the company I have with all the books and articles and things of that nature, apps and stuff. And then at RP Dr. Mike on Instagram, RPDRMIKE. And Mike Israetel on Facebook. Though Facebook is dying a slow death, I'm still on there. And I guess I have a whole lot of YouTube videos now. If you go to Renaissance Periodization on YouTube, or you Google RP Plus Mike and James, every week we do a YouTube webinar where we answer people's questions through RP Plus, and that's really cool. So if you get bored and you need cardio listening, then just go on YouTube or type in Mike Israetel podcast, and there's a whole bunch of my shit on there.
So that was episode number 6 with Dr. Mike Israetel. I hope you found it very useful. I really enjoyed recording that episode with Dr. Mike, and you can find all of the links to Mike's social media profiles and Renaissance Periodization down in the show notes, as well as the timestamps as per usual. I hope that you join me for the next episode. It's going to be very interesting. It's going to be a little bit different, but I think that most people who are into this kind of overall self-improvement, self-development will really enjoy the next episode. So please do make sure to check back in next week to come in and join me on that episode. Again, if you enjoyed the podcast, please do leave a rating and review. And if you have any questions or feedback, you can get me at Instagram, AdamMac192, or you can email me at adam@healthmastery.co. And all of those details, again, are in the show notes. So I look forward to chatting to you in the next episode.